The man I loved stood at that microphone holding an award that had my fingerprints all over it, and I smiled like I was proud of him. That Thursday afternoon had the kind of quiet energy that settles into a room when something important is about to happen. The conference hall smelled like fresh coffee and dry-cleaned suits. Rows of chairs filled up slowly, people finding their spots, adjusting their lanyards, exchanging the kind of low, polite conversation that fills space without saying much. I had arrived early, the way I always did, and taken a seat in the third row, close enough to see clearly, far enough to stay invisible. A habit, I realized later, that had defined more of my life than I ever intended. Marcus Webb walked in 15 minutes before the ceremony started. He moved through the room the way he always did, like the space was already his, like people had been waiting for him specifically. Tall, easy in his posture, with that half-smile that landed somewhere between confidence and charm. A few colleagues reached out to shake his hand. He obliged each one without breaking stride. I watched him and felt something I could not quite name yet. Something that sat just underneath admiration, something with edges. The award was called the Innovation Leadership Recognition. The industry gave it out once a year to an individual or team that had demonstrated, as the presenter put it, a genuinely transformative approach to strategic consulting. When they called Marcus's name, the applause was immediate and full. He walked up, accepted the plaque with both hands, and looked out at the audience with an expression so perfectly calibrated between gratitude and quiet confidence that I almost believed it myself. He thanked his team. He thanked the committee. He talked about the framework, the one that had apparently set the standard for how mid-market companies could approach structural reorganization without losing operational momentum. He described its architecture with authority, with fluency, with the ease of someone who had lived inside an idea long enough to call it home. I had built that framework over 4 months. Late evenings at my kitchen table, notebooks covered in diagrams, revision after revision until the logic was airtight. Marcus had come to me with a rough instinct, a direction, the shape of a feeling. I had turned it into something that could survive contact with the real world. That was what I did. That was what I had always done with him. When he caught my eye from the stage, he smiled. Not the performed smile he gave the room, something smaller, more direct, like an acknowledgement, like a receipt. I smiled back, steady, warm, giving him absolutely nothing to worry about. And in that precise moment, something shifted inside me. Not dramatically, not with heat or noise. It was more like a door closing very gently in a quiet room. A soft click that no one else hears, but that changes everything about the space. I understood, sitting in that third row with my hands folded in my lap, that I had been watching my own work accept an award for itself, and that Marcus had stood at that microphone without a single moment of hesitation, because somewhere along the way he had stopped knowing the difference between what he had built and what I had built for him. That distinction, I decided, was about to matter very much. If this story is already getting to you, you know what to do. Subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps, and there is a lot more coming. 8 months before that Thursday, Marcus had shown up at my door on a Sunday evening with his laptop bag over one shoulder and the particular look of a man who needed help but hadn't figured out how to ask for it yet. We had been together for just over a year at that point, long enough that I knew his rhythms, his silences, the specific quality of tension he carried in his shoulders when something at work was going wrong. He sat down at my kitchen table without being invited to, the way you do when a place has started to feel like yours, and opened his laptop. His biggest client prospect had gone quiet for 3 weeks. 2 smaller clients had quietly moved their contracts elsewhere. The pitch framework he had been using for years was producing polite responses and no signatures. He was not failing yet, not in any visible way, but he could feel the ground shifting under him. And Marcus was the kind of person who experienced uncertainty as a personal insult. I made coffee. I sat across from him. I asked him to walk me through everything from the beginning, not the polished version, the real one. He did, and as he talked, I listened the way I always listened, not just to what he was saying, but to the shape of what he was missing. There was a real insight buried in his approach, something genuinely useful about how he thought about organizational resistance during restructuring. But it was tangled up in assumptions he had never examined, and language that asked clients to trust without giving them a reason to. By the end of that evening, I had filled 6 pages of a yellow notepad. By the following weekend, I had a working draft of something that actually held together. I was not doing it for credit. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. I was doing it because I found the problem interesting, because I cared about him, and because turning a scattered idea into a clean structure gave me a specific kind of satisfaction that I had never found a better word for than home. That was the beginning. Or rather, that was where I can trace the beginning now, looking back. At the time, it felt like partnership. It felt like 2 people building something together in the natural, uneven way that real partnership works, where one person brings the vision and the other brings the architecture, and neither one keeps score because the whole point is that it works. What I did not see clearly enough then was that a system without boundaries does not stay balanced on its own. It drifts. And the direction of the drift is almost always toward whoever is receiving more than they are giving, because that person has no reason to correct it, and every reason not to notice it at all. Marcus was not a dishonest man, not in the way that word usually means. He did not lie. He did not plan any of it. He simply accepted what was offered, and then accepted it again, and then again, until accepting became assuming, and assuming became ownership, and ownership became the award on that Thursday afternoon, and the smile from the stage that asked nothing and owed nothing. I poured the last of the coffee and watched him type on his laptop across the table from me, absorbed and unhurried, already moving on to the next thing. And I thought, quietly, without bitterness, that the most invisible kind of taking is the kind where nobody ever says the word. The moment I realized what was actually happening did not come from Marcus. It came from a stranger at a dinner party who had no idea she was handing me a key. It was a Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after the award ceremony. Marcus had been invited to a client dinner, one of those carefully arranged gatherings where the food is good and the conversation is even more calculated. I came along the way I usually did, introduced as his partner, seated beside him, present but peripheral. The restaurant was warm and low-lit, the kind of place where candles do the heavy lifting and every surface is dark wood and quiet intention. I remember the smell of it, cedar and garlic and something sweet underneath, and the particular sound of a room full of people performing ease. Midway through the evening, a woman named Sandra, a senior advisor at the client firm, leaned across the table toward Marcus, and said something that landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. She said his framework had changed the way her entire team approached reorganization decisions. She said it felt, and I remember her exact word, instinctive. Like it had been built by someone who understood not just the strategy, but the human cost of getting it wrong. She looked genuinely moved by it, the way people look when something has made their work feel less impossible. Marcus nodded, gracious and warm, and said that some ideas just click into place when the timing is right. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The ice was almost fully melted. I watched it for a moment and thought about Sandra, about the fact that she was describing something real, something that had genuinely helped her, and that she had no reason to know it had not come from the person sitting across from her. And I thought about Marcus, about the phrase he had just used, ideas clicking into place, as if the framework had arrived fully formed, a gift from some neutral creative force, rather than something a specific person had built on purpose with specific thought. That was the first piece. The second came a few days later, not at a dinner, not in public, but in the ordinary quiet of a weekday morning. I had been going through old emails looking for a document I needed, and I found, almost by accident, a thread I had half forgotten. It was from about 7 months back, a chain between Marcus and a colleague at another firm. They were discussing the restructuring framework in detail, its logic, its language, its design principles. Marcus was explaining it with fluency and precision. Every point he made was something I had written. Not a version of it, not an adaptation. The exact phrasing, the exact sequence of reasoning, down to a specific analogy I had invented one evening when I was trying to explain why operational resistance behaves the way it does in the first year of any major change. He had not even changed the analogy. He had used it word for word, in writing, to someone he wanted to impress. I sat at my desk and read the thread twice. The second time, more slowly. Outside, a car passed on the street below, and someone was mowing a lawn 2 houses down, and the world was doing all the ordinary things the world does when something inside you is quietly rearranging itself. I was not angry. I want to say that clearly because I think people expect anger in moments like this, and I understand why. But what I felt was more like the experience of finally seeing the correct shape of something you had been looking at from the wrong angle for a long time. Disorienting, yes, but also clarifying in a way that anger never quite is. Anger wants to move fast. What I felt wanted to be still and think. I closed the laptop and went to make tea. And while the kettle heated up, I started, very quietly, to understand something that would take me a little longer to fully accept. The thing I had been calling partnership had a different structure than I had thought. It had a center and it had a support, and I had never been the center. That realization did not break me, but it did change everything about what I was willing to do next, and what I was no longer willing to do at all. And the difference between those two things was about to become the most important line I had ever drawn. The first thing I did was go back through everything, not quickly, not emotionally, but carefully, the way you audit something when you need to understand its full scope before you decide what to do about it. I spent parts of 3 evenings at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, working through notebooks, documents, email drafts, shared folders. I was not looking for evidence in some dramatic sense. I was not building a case. I was simply trying to understand the true size of what had happened, because I had a feeling it was larger than the email thread, larger than the award, larger than any single moment I could point to. It was. The framework that won Marcus the award was the most visible piece, but it was nowhere near the only one. There was a client proposal from about a year earlier that had landed him a contract worth a significant amount. The proposal that had first made people in his industry start paying attention to him in a different way. I had rewritten that proposal over a single weekend when he had been stuck on it for weeks. I remembered the weekend clearly. The rain against the windows, the specific tiredness in my hands by Sunday evening, the satisfaction when it finally came together. I had sent it to him and thought nothing more of it. There was a keynote outline he had delivered at a regional conference, the one that a trade publication had described as refreshingly clear-eyed. I had written the structure and the 3 central arguments. He had added the delivery, the pauses, the eye contact. And those things mattered. I want to be fair about that. But the bones of it were mine. There were smaller things, too. Countless smaller things. Emails rephrased before sending. Talking points sharpened before calls. A single paragraph inserted into a contract negotiation document that had shifted the entire framing in his favor. Each one had felt, at the time, like the natural texture of a close relationship where 2 people help each other. Accumulated together, over time, they told a different story. I closed the last folder and sat in the quiet of my kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. I thought about the word invisible, about how it can mean 2 completely different things, depending on who is experiencing it. There is the invisibility of a person who chooses to stay in the background, because the background suits them. And there is the invisibility of a person who has been placed there so gradually and so gently that they never noticed it happening. I had started as the first and had become the second without a single conversation about it, without a single moment where the shift was acknowledged. And that, more than any specific document or phrase or uncredited idea, was what finally settled into me as the thing I could not continue to accept. I did not call Marcus that evening. I did not send a message. I made a fresh cup of tea, sat back down at the table, and I started thinking forward instead of backward. Because the question was not what had happened. That part was clear enough now. The question was what I was actually going to do, and whether I had the patience to do it the right way. I had one significant advantage that Marcus did not know about yet. I understood the structure better than he did, which meant I also understood exactly where it was fragile and what would happen when it was finally asked to hold its own weight alone. Priya Nair called me first, and that detail still matters to me because I had not reached out to her, had not hinted at anything, had not sent a signal of any kind. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of rain that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply settles in and stays, turning the windows gray and making the whole day feel slightly slower than it should. I was at my desk when my phone lit up with her name. We had stayed in loose contact since meeting at an industry event a couple of years back. The occasional message, a comment on something professional, the kind of connection that exists in the background of your life without demanding anything. I almost did not answer. I was in the middle of something, and my head was still very much in the audit I had finished the night before, still sitting with the full weight of what I had cataloged. I answered anyway. She asked how I was doing in the way that sometimes means exactly that, and sometimes means something more specific. I told her I was fine, which was true in the practical sense. She paused for just a moment, and then she said she had been thinking about something and wondered if I would want to meet for lunch sometime that week. Nothing urgent, she said, just a conversation. We met at a small place near the waterfront, the kind of cafe that smells like roasted coffee and old wood, with mismatched chairs and windows that look out onto the street at just the right angle to make the rain seem almost pleasant. Priya was already there when I arrived, sitting with both hands around a coffee cup, watching the street. She was the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, and whose questions, when they came, tended to land somewhere you had not expected. I had always respected that about her. We talked through lunch about general things at first, industry updates, people we both knew, the usual texture of conversation between two people who are circling toward a real subject. Then she set her cup down and looked at me directly and said something that I have thought about many times since. She said she had been watching Marcus's rise over the past couple of years with genuine curiosity, because the quality of thinking in his work had always seemed, and she chose her word carefully, inconsistent with the quality of his instincts in conversation. She said it without judgment, almost clinically, the way someone describes a data point that does not fit the model. I did not say anything immediately. I looked out at the rain on the street and let her words settle. Then she said, quietly, that she suspected the source of that inconsistency was sitting across from her right now. The cafe was warm. Someone behind the counter was grinding coffee, and the sound filled the space for a moment, loud and then gone. I felt something move through me. Not embarrassment, not relief exactly, something more like the particular sensation of being seen clearly for the first time in a long time by someone who had no reason to be kind about it. I told her she was not wrong. She nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the calm of someone whose working theory had just been confirmed. And then she told me what she actually wanted to say, which was that Hyan, her firm, was building something, and that she had been looking for a specific kind of mind, one that understood not just strategy, but the structural integrity underneath it, the part that determines whether something holds when conditions change. She said she thought I might be exactly that, and that if I was ever open to a conversation about it, she would like to have one. I did not say yes that afternoon. I told her I needed to think, which was honest. But I drove home with the windows slightly fogged and the radio off, and I thought about what it had felt like to be named, to have someone look at the actual source of something rather than the person standing in front of it. It felt unfamiliar, and it felt, underneath the unfamiliarity, like something I had not realized I had been waiting for. The decision to stop, when it finally came, did not feel like a decision at all. It felt more like putting down something heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. I did not call Marcus. I did not send a message explaining anything or drawing any lines out loud. There was no conversation, no confrontation, no moment of declared intention. I simply stopped doing the things I had always done, and I did it quietly enough that the absence would not be immediately legible as a choice. The first thing I stopped was the late-night reviews. Marcus had a habit of sending me documents in the evening, proposals, pitch decks, strategy memos, always with a casual message attached, something like, "Can you take a look when you get a chance?" or, "Just want a second pair of eyes on this." The messages had the tone of a small request. The reality was that those documents almost always came back from me substantially different, tighter, more defensible, stripped of the assumptions that would have invited the wrong questions. I had never tracked how often it happened. I started tracking it the week I stopped. In the first 2 weeks alone, he sent me 7 documents. I read each one and put my phone face down without responding. The second thing I stopped was the verbal preparation. Before any significant meeting or call, Marcus and I had a pattern. He would talk through what he was planning to say, and I would listen. And somewhere in that listening, I would ask a question or reframe a point, and the thing he walked into the meeting with was measurably sharper than the thing he had started with. It had felt like conversation. It had functioned as editing. I stopped initiating those conversations and let the silence where they used to be simply exist. What surprised me was how quickly he filled that silence with confidence. He did not seem to notice the absence, at least not at first. He walked into the next 2 weeks the way he always did, assured and forward-moving, running on the reputation the previous work had built and the momentum that reputation generated. Watching it from the outside, you would have seen no difference at all. But I was not watching from the outside. I was watching from the position of someone who knew exactly what questions his next proposal would not be able to answer, and exactly when someone would think to ask them. And the timeline for that, I understood, was not a matter of if. It was only a matter of when the work would be asked to carry more weight than it had been quietly reinforced to hold. That moment was coming. And for the first time in a long time, I was not going to be there to prevent it. Priya called me on a Wednesday morning and said 4 words that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. She said, "They picked the date." The client meeting had been set for the following Thursday, which meant I had exactly 8 days to finish what Priya and I had been building together. And Marcus had 8 days to walk into a room carrying work that no longer had anyone quietly reinforcing it from underneath. I sat with that for a moment after the call ended, the phone still warm in my hand, the morning light coming through the window at a low angle that made everything in the room look sharper than usual. Priya and I had been meeting twice a week for the past 3 weeks, always at her office, a clean and deliberately uncluttered space on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like fresh paper and climate-controlled air. She had a long table by the window where we spread everything out. Frameworks, models, client data, the kind of organized mess that looks chaotic from the doorway and makes complete sense from the inside. I had not felt that kind of working clarity in a long time. The difference between doing this work openly, with my name attached to it, and doing it invisibly inside someone else's process was something I had not fully understood until I was on the other side of it. It was the difference between building something and leaving it on the doorstep. The project was a genuine one, a mid-market company facing a significant structural decision, 2 possible directions, each with its own set of risks that depended heavily on assumptions about timing and internal capacity. The kind of problem that looks solvable on a surface read and reveals its real complexity only when you start stress testing the layers underneath. Marcus was competing for the same work. His proposal had been submitted the previous week, and from what Priya had heard through the professional channels that these things travel, it was polished and confident and built on a framework that by now I knew better than he did. I spent the last few days before the meeting going through our proposal with the kind of attention I used to give his work, not because I was anxious, but because I respected the problem enough to take it seriously. I checked every dependency in the model. I mapped the places where a skeptical question could land and made sure the answer was already built into the structure rather than waiting to be improvised. I thought about the people who would be in that room, what they would be hoping to hear, what they would be afraid of, and what they needed to believe before they could say yes to anything. The night before the meeting, I closed my laptop at a reasonable hour, made dinner, and went to bed. I did not replay the presentation in my head. I did not run worst-case scenarios. I had done the work. That was the thing I had learned to trust. Not outcomes, not impressions, but the quality of the preparation underneath. What I did not know, lying there in the quiet dark, was that Marcus had spent that same evening sending me 3 messages. I would not see them until the next morning. The first asked if I had a few minutes to look at something. The second, sent about an hour later, said it was not urgent, but he was trying to tighten a section and wanted a second opinion. The third, sent just before midnight, said never mind, he had figured it out. He had not figured it out. That much I would understand later, but I did not know it yet. What I knew, reading those 3 messages over coffee the next morning, with the sun just starting to warm the kitchen floor, was that the habit was still there in him, the reflex of reaching toward a support that was no longer in place, and that he had caught himself reaching and filled the gap with confidence instead. And that confidence, untested and unsupported, was what he was about to walk into that room with. I put my phone down and finished my coffee. Then I picked up my bag and went to meet Priya. The conference room where the client meeting was held was on the upper floor of a building downtown, with wide windows that looked out over the city in a way that made everything below seem organized and purposeful. I had been in rooms like this many times, always in a supporting role, always slightly off to the side. This time, I was at the table. Priya opened the session with a brief context setting that was calm and precise and took exactly as long as it needed to. Then she handed the floor to me. I felt the shift in the room when that happened, the adjustment in attention as the people across the table recalibrated their expectations. I knew that feeling. I had watched it happen for Marcus many times. The difference was that this time, what came next actually belonged to the person standing in front of it. I walked them through the proposal the way I had built it, starting not with the solution, but with the problem in its full, honest shape. I named the places where the obvious approach would fail and explained why. I showed them where the real risk lived, not in the headline numbers, but in the second-level assumptions that most proposals simply asked clients to accept on trust. And then I showed them what we had built instead, a structure that did not require perfect conditions to hold, that had room for the variables that would inevitably move. The questions started about halfway through. Good ones, the kind that push rather than probe, that assume intelligence on both sides of the conversation. I answered each one directly, without hedging, without performing more certainty than the situation warranted. When one of the senior advisors asked about a specific dependency I had flagged in the model, I walked her through it in detail, and I watched something shift in her expression. A small but unmistakable movement from evaluation to recognition. Across the hall, in a room I could not see, Marcus was presenting to a different segment of the same client group. I did not know what was happening in there. I did not let myself think about it. I stayed exactly where I was, in the room in front of me, with the work that was mine, and I gave it everything it deserved. It was only after the meeting ended, after the handshakes and the careful professional warmth of a session that has gone well, that Priya caught my eye across the table and gave me the quietest nod I had ever seen communicate this much. And something in my chest that had been held at a certain tension for a very long time, finally, almost imperceptibly, released. But the day was not finished, and what happened next, I had not prepared for at all. Marcus was standing in the hallway when I walked out of that conference room, and the look on his face told me everything about how his session had gone. He was leaning against the wall near the elevator, his jacket still on, his portfolio tucked under one arm, and he had the specific stillness of someone who has just absorbed something they were not prepared for and has not yet decided how to carry it. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air, the kind of neutral, corporate smell that belongs to no one. A few people moved past us in both directions, focused on their own things, paying no attention to two people standing in a corridor with a significant amount of unspoken history between them. He saw me at almost the same moment I saw him. There was a half second where neither of us moved, and in that half second, I felt the full weight of everything that had led to this specific hallway, this specific afternoon, this specific distance between us. Then he straightened slightly and said my name. I stopped. I did not move toward him, and I did not move away. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness that comes from performing confidence for too long without anything solid underneath it. The exhaustion of holding a shape that does not quite fit anymore. I recognized it because I had watched him build that shape, had quietly helped him maintain it, and knew better than anyone what it cost to sustain it alone. He asked how my session had gone. The question was professional on the surface, and something else entirely underneath, and we both knew it. I told him it had gone well. He nodded, and I watched him process that, watched him fit it into the picture he was assembling in real time. Then he said something I had not expected. He said he had struggled in there. Not dramatically, not with the kind of language people use when they want sympathy. He said it the way someone states a fact they have just confirmed, plainly, without dressing it up. He said there were questions he had not been able to answer the way he wanted to, and that he had felt, for the first time in a long time, like the ground under the work was less stable than he had believed. I did not fill the silence that followed. I let it exist. He looked at me and said he had been thinking, since the messages he had sent the night before, about how often he had reached for that particular kind of support without examining what it actually was or where it came from. He said it as though he was thinking out loud, working something through in real time. And maybe he was. There was nothing performed about it. It was the most unguarded I had seen him in longer than I could easily remember. I said, quietly, that the reaching was not the problem. The problem was never noticing what answered. He was still for a moment. Then he said he understood that now. I believed him. Not because the understanding fixed anything, but because it was real. And real was more than I had expected from that hallway on that afternoon. We did not resolve anything standing there. There was nothing to resolve. What had been built between us had already changed shape permanently, and both of us knew it. But something had shifted in the quality of the space between us. Something had been named that had gone unnamed for too long, and that, in its own quiet way, mattered. I told him I hoped the next project went better. He almost smiled. Then the elevator arrived, and we went in separate directions, and the hallway returned to being just a hallway again. The news about the client decision came through the following morning. Priya sent a single message that said simply, "We got it." I read it standing in my kitchen, still in the early part of the day when the light is soft and the city outside is just starting to wake up. I made coffee, stood by the window, and let myself feel it fully, not as a victory over Marcus, but as something that belonged entirely to me. That distinction was important. It still is. Over the weeks that followed, my life rearranged itself around the work at Hyan in a way that felt less like a transition and more like a correction, like a sentence that had been missing a word finally becoming complete. I had an office with my name outside it, my name on the proposals, my name in the conversations where decisions were made. None of it was loud, none of it was performed for anyone. It was simply accurate. And accuracy, after years of its absence, felt extraordinary in the most ordinary way. The project we had won moved forward steadily. The structural model held exactly as it had been designed to hold, not because conditions were perfect, but because it had been built to absorb imperfection without collapsing. The client noticed. They said so directly, in a review meeting about 2 months in, that the difference between what they had expected and what they had received was the quality of the thinking underneath the surface. They used the word reliable. I wrote that word down afterward, not to keep it, but because I wanted to look at it for a moment and understand why it landed the way it did. Reliable. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of word that gets said from a stage at an awards ceremony, but it was the word that described something real, something that had been built with care and remained standing when it was tested. And I understood, sitting with that word, something I had been slowly learning for months. The most durable kind of value is the kind that does not need to announce itself, because it makes itself known when something goes wrong and holds anyway. Marcus's name appeared less frequently in the professional conversations I was part of. Not because anything dramatic had happened to him. No public failure, no scandal, no sudden collapse. It was quieter than that. The momentum that a reputation generates when it is being continuously fed simply began to slow when the feeding stopped. Projects came to him with slightly more hesitation. Questions were asked a little more carefully. The narrative around him, which had once moved forward on its own, now required more effort to maintain. And effort without a certain kind of invisible support is a very different thing from the ease that had made him seem, for a while, almost effortless. I heard about him occasionally through people we both knew. I did not seek the information out. When it came, I received it the way you receive news about weather in a place you used to live, with a certain mild interest and no particular need to go back. About 3 months after the client meeting, I ran into Sandra, the woman from the dinner party who had used the word instinctive to describe the framework I had built. She was at an industry breakfast, the kind of early morning event where everyone is slightly more honest than they would be later in the day because they have not yet had time to fully construct their professional composure. She recognized me from Hyan's work on the project, which had begun circulating in the right conversations, and she said something that completed a circle I had not realized was still open. She said the thinking behind our proposal had reminded her of something she had encountered before, a quality of structure that felt considered rather than assembled. She said she did not know how to explain it better than that. I told her I thought I understood exactly what she meant. She smiled and moved on, and I stood there for a moment with my coffee cup warm in both hands, thinking about how things find their way to their correct source eventually. Not always loudly, not always in the ways you might have imagined, but with a kind of quiet inevitability that feels, once it arrives, like it could not have happened any other way. Here is what this story taught me, and I mean this in the most direct way I know. When you do the real work, the deep work, the kind that holds things together from the inside, and you allow it to exist only inside someone else's story, you are not being generous. You are disappearing, and the world will let you disappear for as long as you are willing to. The moment you stop, the moment you simply put your name on what is yours and let it stand in the open, everything shifts. Not because you took something from anyone, but because you finally stopped giving yourself away. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer. Have you ever built something real, something that worked, something that mattered, and then watched someone else take the credit while you stayed quiet because it felt easier or kinder or just less complicated than saying out loud that it was yours? Because I think more people have lived that than would ever admit it. Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I think this conversation is worth having. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something or think about something you had been putting off thinking about, please leave a like and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and every one of them is built to be worth your time.